Hello there. Today we'll be talking about the Dutch test. So the Dutch is something that I run for a lot of my clients when they're getting into any sort of fitness and nutrition protocol. And it can give us a really good idea of what is going on with their hormones, with their neurotransmitters, and just gives us a further information to design the best fitness and nutrition program for them. So you might be in a position where you are thinking about doing the Dutch or you've done the Dutch test. And what I'm going to go over today are the cortisol numbers in the Dutch test and just explain to you how they work and what they all mean so you have a better idea at the end. So I could go over the whole test, and the whole test is quite large. There's a lot going on here, but what I'm going to focus on primarily is the cortisol numbers for the next few minutes and explain to you what that means. Like cortisol, you probably know, is our stress hormone, our fight or flight hormone that can go up and down throughout the day. Usually it follows the pattern of the sun. So when the sun goes up, your cortisol goes up. The sun's at its highest point, your cortisol is at its highest point. When the sun goes down, the cortisol is at its lowest point. Really, really important hormone for energy, for survival, and for really getting us through any sort of stressful situation. Like I'm producing cortisol right now, for example. The problems with cortisol is when they're chronically high and they don't come down. Also, when they're chronically low and they don't go high, we want it to be varied throughout the day according to the sun. And you can see that here with this pattern. You can see the high range limit there. You can see the low range. This person here is in the red. They're really low with their cortisol production right now. So they're probably suffering from lethargy, decreased motivation, maybe obesity as well is correlated with low cortisol, and hypothyroid as well. Liver function might be tied into that, but we'd need to look further into other tests to establish a pattern there. Now, what you should be aware of is the four markers here. There's your waking cortisol. That's when you first wake up. You want a decent hit of cortisol when you wake up. Then your morning, that's mid-morning where it should be the highest, the afternoon about 3-4 o'clock, and then nighttime. Nighttime should be where it's at its lowest. So if we see this climb up towards there, we know that this person might be one of those people who gets like a second wind at nighttime, has a burst of energy, and finds it hard to get to sleep. That's something we'll look to bring down as we look to prioritize sleep in our health plan as well. Big difference between free cortisol and metabolized cortisol. You can see that here, free cortisol, metabolized cortisol. Free cortisol, think of this as like the stuff that's circulating around the system. So it's the stuff that's there, but not necessarily being used. And this is the cortisol that's being used. And you can see on the dial here, this cortisol is very low, the free cortisol is circulating around. But of that cortisol, it's actually very high. They're using a lot of cortisol. So although it's saying we've got low free cortisol here, the stuff that we're using is really, really high. And this is pretty common. It's common with people in a long-term, say if they've been stressed for a long time, where they're using a lot of cortisol despite not having much. Inflammation is tied to this. Hypothyroid infection, obesity, and insulin resistance actually ties into this as well. So this is a real warning sign for us, and something that we see really common is the body not producing much cortisol, but of the cortisol they're producing, it's that they're using all of it. It's kind of like nearly running on empty, and tired and wired. That sort of thing ties into this equation. Now, let's say if these numbers were reversed and the free cortisol was really high, metabolized cortisol was low, then we'd be looking at something like hypothyroid, in that we're making a lot of cortisol, but we're not actually using it. And that's when we'd see really high cortisol up here. So the cortisol is perceived to be high, but really we're not using much of it. We're tanking. This person's going to feel sluggish despite the high cortisol, and for some reason we're not metabolizing the cortisol, so we'll need to look at how we're going to push that along. We can do that through diet, lifestyle, exercise regimes. So that's a quick rundown of what the adrenal hormones do, the cortisol hormones do. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that we look at, and we'll get into that at a later date. But that's what you need to know for now, and I hope you've learned something today.